Hello, everyone. This is going to be Chapter 17, Part 3, continuing freedom's boundaries at home and abroad by talking about the time period of American imperialism, which sort of coincides with the end of the Gilded Age. So, our primary source is the opening of a poem written by British citizen Rudyard Kipling. Kipling was actually born and raised in India, so he's also kind of a product of imperialism. And during America's time with imperialism, he wrote this poem called The White Man's Burden, saying, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go send your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." This definitely shows a perspective on imperialism that the white people who are doing the imperialism are helping out the people who they are taking over. This entire section of the chapter can really be broken down into the idea of people looking at the white man's burden in a variety of ways. We're going to see this term used several times throughout the rest of this section. So, let's look at America becoming a world power during this time through imperialism. This time period of the late 1800s, especially like 1870 to about 1900, was really a time period where we see a lot of imperialism, expansion, and conquest, especially of European countries taking over non European countries. England, France, Germany, Italy, the Ottoman Empire to a certain degree, even other smaller nations are taking over other areas. And they're expanding through Asia, they're going through the Middle East, the Pacific, Africa, expanding their empires. And America was, for the most part, up until a certain point, not in on this game. We were focused mainly on reuniting the country following the Civil War and expanding westward, which took until about 1890. So here is what the world looked like in 1885, and you can see the imperial map, just how many areas were being taken over, and eventually they move in from the borders of Africa and take over even more. You see things like Australia, New Zealand, the South Pacific. The main goals of expansion and imperialism were generally the acquisition of new territories and also the acquisition of the resources within them. However, the justification for doing so was civilization, that we are civilizing the people that we're taking over. Imperial powers said they were modernizing as well. They're educating, they are Christianizing these areas and these colonies, giving them Western values. Eventually, many of these countries, at least according to the colonizers, would receive their independence and be allowed to rule themselves. This was the goal, but there was usually no timetable in which this would happen. In the meantime, colonies were often exploited and oppressed by their conquerors. So the cartoon on the next page is called The White Man's Burden, just like the poem that we read at the beginning. And here we see America and Great Britain carrying their colonies up the hill over superstition and ignorance and oppression up towards civilization. So they are literally the colonies that they are transporting are the white man's burden. Now, America's expansion came in the latter half of the 1800s, and it was at first mainly restricted to the American West, where we see, we're taking over, all that territory that was in the West there, and it wasn't until about the 1890s that we extended our view beyond our own borders of the contiguous geographic United States. Now, there had been a build up to this a little bit. There had been talk about taking over Cuba or getting the Dominican Republic, but so far this had not come to anything. The last time that America had gotten into the expansion game by taking over a non contiguous area of the United States was in 1867. That's when William Seward bought Alaska. And he did it for a couple reasons. Partially, he did it to stop Russia's expansion into the Americas. He was worried that Russia would basically, since Russia had Alaska, they would go down and they would take California or Oregon or Washington next. However, we also wanted it because the Aleutian chain of islands on the Alaskan coast would make a good sort of pit stop on the way to Asia. So here we see Alaska, which was acquired in 1867, got the nickname Seward's Icebox or Seward's Folly by people who didn't see the beauty of getting Alaska, and that worth that Alaska had, we would find out, was oil and gold. So there were reasons to get Alaska, and you can see the Aleutian Islands down along the bottom there. Now, many Americans were interested in expanding our trade. We had been manufacturing a lot of things like sewing machines and oil and many other things that we wanted to export. But the best way to export is to trade it to colonies and territories. You get the best deals that way. We are also facing economic difficulties after the Civil War, so this kind of trade would be useful. However, going the opposite way, American women had also gotten a taste for Asian imports, especially fashions, so we were interested in trade. Now, there were several reasons that we gave for American imperialism at the time. One was the spread of Protestant Christianity. There was an evangelist named Dwight Moody who got a lot of young missionaries to sort of sign up to become Christian missionaries across the world. This included African Americans and women who were part of what was called the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions. Now, there were some Americans who actively called for imperialism, basically saying that if we don't do it, we're going to lose out. We're going to fall behind all these European nations if we don't get in on this game. There was a guy named Josiah Strong, who was a clergyman, who said that this was basically an expansion of the idea of manifest destiny, getting in a little bit on that frontier thesis that, America's built upon moving west and civilizing and taming the wildness, and we should continue to do so beyond our American borders. There's also Alfred T. Mahan, who was a naval officer who called for a much larger navy. We had a very small navy at the time. In his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, he also told presidential advisors such as James Blaine, the Secretary of State, that taking over nations was a great way of setting up refueling stops on our way to Asia. So here's Josiah Strong, who said, "If I read not amiss, this powerful race will move down upon Mexico, down upon Central and South America, out upon the islands of the sea, over upon Africa and beyond, and can any one doubt that the results of this competition of races will be survival of the fittest?" So basically he's saying we need to expand. Alfred T. Mahan said the same thing. Whether they will or not, Americans must now begin to look outward. The growing production of the country demands it. Also, what is it with people who want imperialism and beards? It seems to be a thing. Anyway, so America's first imperial interest was Hawaii after Alaska. So the reason for this is there were already lots of Americans and also a lot of American interests in Hawaii. There were American-born sugar barons on the islands, and we had a treaty with Hawaii to have a naval base at Pearl Harbor, and also not to pay tariffs on sugar from Hawaii. So in 1893, white plantation owners in Hawaii overthrew the Queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, who was the last queen of Hawaii. Although Congress was very interested in making Hawaii part of America, President Grover Cleveland actually refused to annex them because Native Hawaiians were not in favor. And this is the way it would be until 1898, at which point we're in the middle of a war with Spain. And so President McKinley said, yes, we will make Hawaii part of the United States as a territory, as a colony for the time being. So here's Hawaii. This will become this will become a state in 1959. And here, by the way, is Queen Liliuokalani. She was born in 1838, died in 1917. She's from the Kingdom of Hawaii. She was the queen and last royal ruler of Hawaii from 1891 to 1893. She was arrested after a supposed coup, but really this was almost an excuse for the people who arrested her to arrest her. And she spent the rest of her life basically under house arrest for most of it. And she fought for Hawaiian independence and also Hawaiian nationality, trying to maintain things like the Hawaiian language. She sued for her land back, never quite got it. She also wrote traditional Hawaiian songs, including Aloha Oi, which is probably one of the most famous and well-known Hawaiian songs out there. Here, by the way, is the guy who was the first president of Hawaii, Sanford Dole, 1844 to 1926. Born in Hawaii, he was a lawyer, later on a Supreme Court justice, governor of Hawaii, and the first president of Hawaii while it was a short lived nation before it became part of the United States. His cousin was James Dole, and if that last name sounds familiar, because both of these guys have their hands in the Hawaiian sugar and fruit game. James Dole was the president of the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, which is now Dole Foods. Now, during this time of hardship, we see also an increase in American patriotism. It was believed that a war is sort of good for the national spirit of the country. It unifies people. And one of the loudest people calling for this were people in the yellow press. These are newspapers that tended to be all about getting people to buy newspapers. It exaggerated things like it made big scare headlines. There are reports of crime and corruption, partially because they thought that war was good for the bottom line. Two of the biggest proponents were Joseph Pulitzer, who we mentioned in chapter 16. He's the editor in charge of the New York World, along with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and also William Randolph Hearst, editor of the New York Journal. So here is Hearst, 1863 to 1951, from California. He was the newspaper editor of the New York Journal, congressman from New York, and also the basis of the main character in one of the greatest movies ever made, Citizen Kane by Orson Welles. Charles Foster Kane is based upon William Randolph Hearst. And so a famous quote was William Randolph Hearst sent one of his artists down to Cuba, and the artist sent back a note saying, "There is no war here. I request to be recalled." Hearst, on the other hand, said, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." And he did. All of these factors led to America getting onto the world stage through a war in 1898, the Spanish-American War. So, this started with Cuba. Cuba had been fighting for independence for decades, and America had been sympathetic. If you remember the Monroe Doctrine, we said we would lend our aid to nations trying to throw off the imperial yoke. And calls for American intervention only got louder as reports of Spanish atrocities against the Cubans came into light. Some of these were real, some were yellow press, but the Spanish did do things like they had legit, what they called at the time, concentration camps in Cuba. So, there were reasons that we joined. The other reason that we joined, though, was a ship called the USS Maine. We had sent a warship to Havana Harbor to look over the situation, and on June 15th, 1898, it exploded, killing almost 270 American sailors. However, before we could even investigate to see what had caused this explosion, the yellow journalists had decided that it was a bomb or a mine or something like that, and people were suddenly howling for war. Later on, the investigation found it was actually probably an accident, but by that time we were already in it. America very quickly declared war on Spain, saying that we were only there to assist the Cubans, and that point's going to be important in a bit. In fact, we even backed it up to the point where we said we are so into the idea of just helping out the Cubans that the Teller Amendment, which was part of this declaration of war, basically said we have no intention of taking Cuba for America at the end of the war. This, by the way, is a great example of yellow journalism. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. This is 2 days after the Maine exploded. Nobody knows what caused it, but they decided that, having it be the Spanish was the best story. Now, McKinley's Secretary of State, John Hay, sort of summed up the war as a splendid little war. It was very short, it had very few American deaths, and it allowed for American expansion during this time. America very quickly achieved victories in the Philippines, in Puerto Rico, and in Cuba. So here are the two main areas of the Spanish-American War for us, the Philippine Islands. You can see Admiral Dewey steaming into Manila in the left, and our attack on Cuba on the right-hand side. Now, the battle that gets the most press was the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba. And this was because the guy who was at the lead at the Battle of San Juan Hill really wanted that press. He was the self-appointed hero of the battle was Colonel Teddy Roosevelt and his unit, usually called the Rough Riders. Roosevelt was a very wealthy New Yorker who had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy and helped to build up our Navy during this time period. However, he resigned once the war started in order to go and fight over in the Spanish American War. And he basically put together the Rough Riders out of his own pocket. They were a bunch of his Ivy League friends from Harvard. They were a bunch of cowboys he met when he was a rancher in the Dakotas. He brought everybody in on this. So here is Colonel Teddy Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, from New York City, where he was a New York City assemblyman, a police commissioner, and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He would go on to become a governor of New York, vice president of the United States, and eventually president after the assassination of William McKinley. Interestingly enough, he lost both of his wife and his first wife and his mother on the same day, February 14th. And this depressed him so much that he moved out to the Dakotas to live as a rancher for several years. And yeah, he's the guy from Night at the Museum. Now, Roosevelt and his Rough Riders charged up San Juan Hill. They later found that they were actually beaten there by the segregated units. They beat them up the hill. However, he didn't mention that in his autobiography, called The Rough Riders. People who thought that he was perhaps exaggerating and being a little self-centered called it Alone in Cuba because it sounded like Roosevelt fought the entire war by himself. Now, the popularity of Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, though, did help get him into the governor's chair in New York and eventually the vice presidency, and later he would become president after an assassin's bullet. So here's Roosevelt standing in front of the American flag and the Rough Riders up on San Juan Hill in Cuba. So, although the war was started with the idea of helping the Cubans, it soon expanded into imperialism. McKinley basically said that the Philippines were not quite ready for independence, and so we could not give them back to Spain, so we should instead focus on civilizing them. And in the end, America acquired several pieces of Spanish territory, including Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, the Philippines out in Asia, and the island of Guam in the Central Pacific. So by 1898, here are the places that America owns. You can see Puerto Rico on the right. You can see the Philippines on the left. And in between you have Guam, American Samoa, Wake Island, the Midway Islands, and Hawaii. Now, Cuba was a bit of an interesting situation. We had promised that we were not going to take Cuba. It was our goal to free them. However, McKinley also basically said that if we're going to free them, we still want a hand in what they're doing. So McKinley forced upon the Cubans the Platt Amendment, which basically said that, okay, you guys get your freedom, but America reserves the right to intervene with our military whenever we see fit. And also we get to keep our naval bases in Cuba as well. And this amendment nearly killed Cuban independence, and it heavily divided the Cubans. It was basically seen as America sort of pushing its way into Cuba, even though we had promised not to. By the way, one of the bases we got was Guantanamo Bay, the only American base left in Cuba up through today. The rest were lost when Cuba had a communist revolution back in 1959. During the Cold War, Gitmo was used as a sort of way to have an eye on Cuba during the Cold War. These days, it's used to hold prisoners of the War on Terror, many of them without a trial. Now, a lot of these new acquisitions had to do with our trade desires. Cuba and Puerto Rico were seen as gateways to the sugar islands of the Caribbean, as well as possibly a way to get into Central and South America. The new places we got in the Pacific were good for trade routes, great stops for refueling our coal-fired ships on the way to China and Japan. Also during this time, though, China had been carved into what are called spheres of influence. Basically, a sphere of influence is when a certain country sort of doesn't fully take over another country, but says, this area right here is an area where only we can trade. And so China was sort of divided up into several areas. Our Secretary of State, a guy named John Hay, said that we should have the right to trade anywhere in China. He called this the open door policy. However, that door did only open one way, although it was agreed to finally. Basically, we said we're selling stuff to China and getting stuff from China. However, we are not allowing any Chinese immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act still stands. So here's John Hay, 1838 to 1905, from Indiana. He was our ambassador to Great Britain and Secretary of State, considered one of our greatest secretaries of state by many. He was also the former personal secretary to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War and wrote one of the first biographies of Lincoln. He also helped to get us the Panama Canal. More on that later. So here's a political cartoon. The real trouble will come with the wake, where we see a bunch of different countries surrounding the corpse of China, about to fight over it. Basically, who gets to take over China? Basically. Now, while many of these areas were recently freed from Spain, many of them had a very high opinion of America during the war. That turned around once they realized that we had no intention of giving them autonomy or independence, that we intended to colonize them, as a matter of fact. So we see nationalists from a lot of these new territories started to revolt and to protest against American involvement, and one of the biggest ones, and the bloodiest ones, was in was in the Philippines. So the Filipinos had been fighting Spain for decades, and their leader, a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo, created a new constitution for the Philippines and actually became their first president. However, it was revoked after America said, "You're now a colony of the United States," and this led to the beginning of a civil war in the Philippines, with the Philippines on one side and the Americans on the other. Now, the Philippines remained an American colony until, 1946, not 1846. And here is Emilio Aguinaldo, 1869 and 1964. He was born in a Spanish colony, died in an independent country, and in the meantime, he was an American colony too. He was a general. He was the president of the Philippines from 1899 to 1901. And even though he had signed an allegiance to the United States, he actually sided with the Japanese during World War II, believing that America had basically stabbed the Philippines in the back. So Aguinaldo and the Filipinos started an insurrection that lasted for 4 years, and during that time period from 1899 to 1903, over 4,000 Americans died, 10 times the number of people who died in the entire Spanish-American War, and meanwhile, on the other side, 100,000 Filipinos died. And this Filipino War, which is barely ever discussed anymore, included atrocities and killings, torture on both sides, the targeting of civilians. It was a nasty war. So here is a quote from an American general who said, "Kill everyone over 10." Basically, during the Filipino War, an American general gave the order to execute any men older than 10 years old. McKinley also claimed that America during this time was there to civilize and Christianize, which the Christianize part was interesting since they were already Catholics. But the new American government, led by future President William Howard Taft, did work to modernize the territory. We gave them new roads, better schools. We did try to switch out rice for corn, which doesn't work in the tropics. It doesn't grow, basically. So here's William Howard Taft when he was Governor General of the Philippines, sitting on top of an Asian water buffalo. Later, he would become Secretary of War and then President of the United States as well. So Americans who favored imperialism basically said this was not great, it was not nice, but it was a necessary step towards civilization and hopefully eventually self-determination. It was a selfless endeavor, according to them, by the United States to help those, even if they didn't like the fact that we were helping them. This is sort of the white man's burden of Rudyard Kipling's poem that we saw at the beginning of our section here. However, becoming an empire divided people at home. The Constitution, first of all, has nothing about creating colonies within it. Partially, some people say because as an ex-colony ourselves of Great Britain, many people assumed that the Founding Fathers didn't think we would ever colonize anyone else. Many assume that these colonies would eventually become states, that basically colonization is a stepping stone towards statehood, much as we had done with our territories in the West. However, critics were worried that these colonies were too far away and too different to be a good American-style democracy. So, for instance, the Foraker Act of 1900 said that Puerto Rico would not get full citizenship and did not say you're on the path to statehood. And so we acquired Puerto Rico in 1898, and they are still a territory this year. There were also a series of Supreme Court cases called the Insular cases that said that the Constitution did not fully apply to our territories, and that America could continue to rule over them for a certain amount of time. It didn't say when the end day was. Critics saw this as a betrayal of our own war for independence, that we are now colonizing other people. And the fate of these territories has been varied throughout the 20th century. So, two of our colonies, our territories, Alaska and Hawaii, became states. The Filipinos got their independence in 1946. Cuba got their independence. Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and American Samoa are still territories of the United States. Mainly, they're all citizens except for the Samoans, who are American nationals, which is sort of a step below citizenship. However, none of these colonies or territories has the rights of U.S. citizens, including none of them have the right to vote for President of the United States. So the Spanish-American War also did set a precedent, though. It was the start of America intervening much more in the Western Hemisphere. We were going to do this throughout the 20th century, from Roosevelt with Panama all the way up through the Cold War. Now, the cartoon on the next page is another white man's burden, the white question mark men's burden. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to put it on there. I'll show that one to you in class. So, America's decision to restrict the rights of these territories due to, according to the Insular cases, was that they were alien races who would not understand our principles. And this idea that, they're different, they don't match up with us, had a global impact. We see that relationships between a lot of countries was based upon ethnicity after this, that European and American nations would ally with each other, and Asian and African nations were the ones to be conquered and turned into territories. This included restricting immigration from Asian nations. Oftentimes, people from Asian and African nations were viewed as less than and childlike, sometimes called children of nature. And we oftentimes portrayed our own territories as underdeveloped or savage, as a way to say that, this is why we're taking them over. We're doing it to civilize them. So here, for example, is one from St. Louis. These are Filipinos at the Human Zoo in the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, where they were portrayed basically as a sideshow spectacle. Now, opponents of the imperialism said that basically this goes against the American principles. Some were a bit more cynical. They basically said this is not good for American trade. If we take over territories, then they're just going to want our jobs. There were, however, groups that formed, such as the Anti-Imperialist League, that included people like Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain. Others said that some were more high-minded and said that basically this is not the American way. Others were like, what? This is bad for our jobs. So here's Mark Twain, who said, "I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." So this debate over imperialism was one of the big issues in the election of 1900. William McKinley, President of the United States, was for imperialism. He said it promoted American values and was also good for our economy. His opponent, again, was William Jennings Bryan, just like 4 years before. Bryan was against it, saying that he believed that imperialism was un-American. Now, McKinley won, but we do see that America is very divided on the ideas of imperialism during this time.